My nephew drugged my 87-year-old grandma with sedatives to control her mind. I'm toxicologist who exposed his 2-year scheme. My nephew Brandon drugged my 87-year-old grandmother Patricia with powerful sedatives for 2 years to keep her confused and compliant, while he systematically stole her life savings of $5.6 million, transferred her properties into his name, and isolated her from family by convincing everyone she had dementia, when in reality, she was being chemically sedated every single day. I watched my sharp, brilliant grandmother transform into a confused, shuffling shadow of herself over 18 months. Doctors diagnosed rapidly progressing Alzheimer's disease. The family accepted that Grandma was declining, and Brandon was the devoted grandson caring for her. Everyone praised him for his sacrifice and dedication. When Grandma died in March 2024, Brandon inherited everything because he'd convinced her to change her will while she was drugged. He sold her house within 2 weeks and moved to Miami with millions of dollars. At the funeral, he cried and talked about how hard it was watching Grandma decline into dementia, how he'd done everything possible to care for her, how he'd miss her every day. But I'm Dr. Rebecca Morrison, 43 years old, a clinical toxicologist who spent 19 years analyzing drug effects and poisoning cases. I knew dementia doesn't progress that rapidly in someone who is completely healthy 6 months earlier. I knew the symptoms Grandma displayed weren't consistent with Alzheimer's. I suspected pharmaceutical manipulation, and I was determined to prove it. This is the story of how my nephew drugged my grandmother into compliance for 2 years while stealing everything she owned, and how I used toxicology and forensic evidence to prove it, get him convicted of murder and elder abuse, send him to prison for 30 years, and recover every penny he stole. My grandmother, Patricia Morrison, was the most remarkable woman I'd ever known. She was 87 years old in 2022, and she was sharper than most 50-year-olds. She'd been a corporate attorney for 45 years, retiring in 2005. She'd invested wisely and built a substantial estate worth approximately $5.6 million, including her home in Scottsdale, Arizona, worth $1.8 million, investment accounts worth $3.2 million, and various other assets. Grandma was independent and strong-willed and incredibly intelligent. She lived alone, drove herself everywhere, managed all her own finances, traveled frequently, volunteered with legal aid organizations. She had an active, vibrant life. I'm Grandma's oldest granddaughter. I've always been extremely close to her. She encouraged me to go to medical school and supported me through my entire education. I became a clinical toxicologist working at the Arizona Poison Control Center and teaching at University of Arizona Medical School. I specialized in pharmaceutical poisoning and drug interactions. Grandma was so proud of my career, and we talked several times a week about everything. Grandma had 5 grandchildren, myself, Rebecca, age 43, my brother Thomas, age 40, my sister Jennifer, age 38, my cousin Brandon, age 36, and my cousin Michelle, age 33. Grandma loved all of us, but she'd always had concerns about Brandon. He'd struggled with money his entire adult life. He'd had several failed businesses. He'd borrowed money from family members and not repaid it. He'd declared bankruptcy in 2018. By 2021, Brandon was deeply in debt and desperate for money. He'd been fired from his sales job for embezzling from his employer. Though they didn't prosecute to avoid publicity, Brandon was essentially unemployable and facing financial ruin. In January 2022, Brandon started visiting Grandma much more frequently than he ever had before. He'd show up at her house several times a week, offering to help with errands and household tasks. Grandma was pleased initially because Brandon had never been particularly attentive. She told me during one of our phone calls, "Brandon has been coming around so much lately, helping me with things. It's nice to see him making an effort. Maybe he's finally growing up and taking responsibility." I was cautiously optimistic that Brandon was changing, but something felt off about his sudden devotion. He'd never cared much about family before, and now he was at Grandma's house constantly. I mentioned my concerns to my mother, and she said I was being unfairly judgmental, that people can change, and Brandon deserved credit for stepping up. In March 2022, I noticed during a phone call that Grandma seemed slightly confused. She repeated herself a few times and seemed to lose track of our conversation briefly. When I asked if she was feeling okay, she said she'd been very tired lately and her doctor had prescribed some medication to help her sleep. She said Brandon had been great about making sure she took her medications on schedule. That comment struck me as odd because Grandma had always been meticulous about her own medications. She didn't need anyone reminding her or helping her, but I dismissed it thinking maybe age was catching up with her and she appreciated the help. Over the next few months, Grandma's decline was rapid and shocking. By June 2022, she was noticeably confused during our phone calls. She'd forget what we'd talked about from one call to the next. She'd repeat questions multiple times. She seemed disoriented about dates and times. When I visited her in person, in July, I was horrified. Grandma looked like she'd aged 10 years in 6 months. She shuffled when she walked. She had difficulty following conversations. She seemed sedated and slow. Her sharp wit and quick mind were gone. In their place was a confused elderly woman who seemed lost in her own home. I asked Brandon, who was there during my visit, what was happening with Grandma. Brandon's face was concerned and sad. The doctors think it's Alzheimer's disease, Rebecca. It came on really fast. I've been taking her to all her appointments, and they've run tests. Her cognitive function has declined dramatically. The neurologist said some people have rapidly progressing forms. I've been trying to help her as much as possible, but it's heartbreaking to watch. I asked to see Grandma's medication list, and Brandon showed me a paper with multiple medications. I recognized some as typical for elderly patients, but there were several I wasn't familiar with, Brandon said. The doctors kept adjusting her medications, trying to slow the progression. I made note of the medication names to research later. When I got home, I researched the medications on Grandma's list. Most were legitimate and appropriate, but 3 of them concerned me deeply. One was Haloperidol, which is an antipsychotic typically used for severe agitation in dementia patients, but rarely appropriate for someone in early stages. Another was Lorazepam, which is a powerful benzodiazepine sedative. The third was Quetiapine, another antipsychotic sedative. This combination would cause exactly the symptoms Grandma was displaying: severe confusion, sedation, cognitive impairment, motor slowing. If someone was giving Grandma these medications at high doses or more frequently than prescribed, they would appear to have dementia, when in reality they were being chemically sedated. I called Grandma's primary care physician, Dr. Helen Carter, to ask about the medications. Dr. Carter seemed confused. I didn't prescribe those medications. Rebecca, Patricia is on blood pressure medication and a statin. That's it. She's been quite healthy. I haven't seen her for a regular checkup in about 4 months, because her grandson said she's been too confused to come to appointments. He's been managing her care with specialists. I asked which specialists, and Dr. Carter didn't know. Brandon had apparently taken over all of Grandma's medical care without involving her longtime physician. This was a massive red flag. I tried to talk to Grandma directly about her medications, but she was too confused to have a coherent conversation. She kept saying, "Brandon gives me my pills. He takes good care of me. I trust Brandon." When I asked if I could see the actual pill bottles, she couldn't remember where they were. Brandon keeps them somewhere safe so I don't get confused. I asked Brandon directly about the medications and where they'd been prescribed. Brandon said Grandma was seeing a geriatric psychiatrist, Dr. Michael Stevens, for the dementia and behavioral issues. Dr. Stevens had prescribed the medications to help manage Grandma's symptoms. I asked for Dr. Stevens' contact information, and Brandon gave me a phone number. When I called the number, it went to a disconnected voicemail. I looked up Dr. Michael Stevens in Arizona medical databases and found no geriatric psychiatrist by that name. Brandon had made up a fake doctor. I confronted Brandon about the fake doctor and he got defensive and angry. "Rebecca, you're always so suspicious of everyone. I must have given you the wrong number. Grandma sees several doctors and I get confused about which is which. Why are you attacking me when I'm trying to help our grandmother? You live your busy, important life as a doctor, and I'm the one here every day taking care of her. Maybe you should appreciate what I'm doing instead of accusing me of things. He stormed out, and I was left feeling like I was the problem. But my toxicology training was screaming that something was very wrong. I decided to document everything systematically. I started visiting Grandma twice a week without telling Brandon I was coming. I'd observe her medication routine, her symptoms, her behavior. I found that Brandon was there almost every day. He'd arrive in the morning with coffee and breakfast for Grandma. I watched him give her pills with breakfast. She'd take them obediently. Within an hour, she'd become noticeably more sedated and confused. By afternoon, she'd be shuffling around, barely able to form complete sentences. By evening, she'd often fall asleep in her chair. This pattern repeated every day I observed. I managed to obtain samples of the pills Brandon was giving Grandma. I told Grandma I wanted to check her medications, and she handed me her pill organizer that Brandon filled. I took photos of the pills and brought samples to my toxicology lab. Analysis confirmed my suspicions. The pills included haloperidol 10 milligrams twice daily, which is an extremely high dose. Lorazepam 4 milligrams 3 times daily, which is massive and would cause severe sedation, and Quetiapine 200 milligrams twice daily. This combination at these doses would render anyone confused and sedated, regardless of their baseline cognitive function. Grandma wasn't developing dementia. She was being systematically drugged into appearing demented. But I needed to prove Brandon was doing this deliberately and that he had a motive. I hired a private investigator named David Chen to look into Brandon's finances and activities. What David found was shocking. Over the past 6 months, since Grandma's decline began, Brandon had systematically stolen from her. He'd added himself to her bank accounts as a joint owner. He'd been transferring money from her accounts to his accounts, amounts ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, totaling approximately $800,000 over 6 months. He'd also convinced Grandma to sign a new power of attorney document, giving him complete control over her finances and healthcare decisions. He'd used that power of attorney to refinance her house and take out $400,000 in equity. He'd convinced her to add his name to the deed of her house as joint owner with rights of survivorship. He'd changed her investment account beneficiaries from her 5 grandchildren equally to Brandon exclusively. He'd convinced her to change her will, leaving everything to him. Every single one of these documents had been signed by Grandma during the period when she was heavily sedated. Her signatures were shaky and barely legible. She clearly had not been in a state of mind to understand what she was signing. Brandon had created pharmaceutical impairment and exploited it to steal everything. I brought all my evidence to my family. I called a meeting with my parents, my siblings, and my aunt, who is Brandon's mother. I presented the medical evidence showing the medications were inappropriate and were causing Grandma's symptoms. I showed the financial evidence of Brandon's systematic theft. I showed the timeline proving the decline started exactly when Brandon started giving Grandma medications. I explained that Grandma didn't have dementia. She was being drugged. Brandon was poisoning her to control her and steal from her. My Aunt Patricia refused to believe it. She said I was being cruel and vindictive toward Brandon, that I was making wild accusations because I was jealous that Brandon was closer to Grandma now. My mother was conflicted. She said it seemed far-fetched, but she'd talked to Brandon. My father took it seriously and said we needed to investigate further. My siblings believed me because they'd seen how suspicious the situation was. The family was divided. Brandon found out about my accusations and he threatened to sue me for defamation. He claimed I was trying to turn the family against him because I was angry he was caring for Grandma instead of me. He said I was a terrible granddaughter who only showed up occasionally while he was there every single day, sacrificing his life to care for her. He played the martyr perfectly. I decided I needed definitive proof that would be unquestionable. I went to Grandma's house when I knew Brandon would be there. I brought a hidden camera disguised as a pen in my pocket. I recorded our visit. On the recording, you can see Brandon preparing Grandma's morning pills. He takes multiple pill bottles from his bag, not from Grandma's medicine cabinet. He counts out pills into her pill organizer. You can see him give her 6 pills with her breakfast. She takes them without question. Over the next hour on recording, you can watch Grandma become progressively more sedated and confused. She's coherent and relatively normal when I first arrive. Within an hour, she's slurring her words and barely able to follow conversation. The effect of the drugs in real time is undeniable. I also managed to take photos of the pill bottles in Brandon's bag. When he went to the bathroom, the bottles had pharmacy labels from a pharmacy in Mexico. The prescriptions were written for someone named Carlos Mendez, not for Patricia Morrison. Brandon was obtaining the medications illegally from Mexico, using fake prescriptions and giving them to Grandma to sedate her. This was pharmaceutical poisoning and fraud and elder abuse, all combined. I took everything to the police. In August 2022, I filed a report with the Scottsdale Police Department Elder Abuse Unit. I provided the medication analysis showing inappropriate sedatives at dangerous doses, the financial records showing $800,000 transferred from Grandma's accounts to Brandon's, the power of attorney and property documents signed while Grandma was impaired, the video recording showing Brandon administering the pills and Grandma's subsequent impairment, the photos of pill bottles with fake prescriptions, the investigator's report documenting the timeline. I had an overwhelming case. Detective Sarah Williams was assigned to investigate. She took my evidence seriously and opened a criminal investigation. She interviewed Grandma's doctors, who confirmed they had not prescribed the medications Brandon was giving her. She interviewed the pharmacy in Mexico, whose labels were on the bottles, and they confirmed the prescriptions were fraudulent. She obtained Brandon's financial records showing the money he'd stolen. She interviewed Grandma's neighbors, who reported seeing Brandon there constantly and seeing Grandma's decline. Everything supported my allegations. On September 15th, 2022, police arrested Brandon at Grandma's house. He was charged with elder abuse, pharmaceutical fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, theft, and conspiracy. Police seized all the medications he had. They obtained a court order requiring Grandma to be evaluated by independent physicians not connected to Brandon. Most importantly, they banned Brandon from any contact with Grandma while the investigation proceeded. Within 48 hours of Brandon being banned from contact with Grandma, the change was remarkable. Without the daily sedatives, her cognition started improving. Within a week, she was noticeably more alert. Within 2 weeks, she was having coherent conversations. Within a month, she was almost back to her baseline cognitive function. It was like watching someone wake up from a 2-year fog. Grandma didn't have dementia at all. She'd been chemically sedated for nearly 2 years, and now that the drugs were stopped, her sharp mind returned. The independent physicians confirmed she had no Alzheimer's or dementia. She'd been pharmacologically impaired by someone giving her inappropriate medications. Grandma was horrified when she learned what Brandon had done. She had fragmented memories of the past 2 years. She remembered taking pills Brandon gave her. She remembered signing papers he put in front of her, but not understanding what they were. She remembered feeling confused and scared all the time. She said it felt like being trapped in her own mind, unable to think clearly. It was the most frightening experience of her life. She was devastated that her own grandson had done this to her. She'd trusted him completely, and he'd exploited that trust in the cruelest way possible. The financial audit revealed the full extent of Brandon's theft over the 20 months from January 2022 to September 2022. Brandon had stolen or fraudulently obtained $1.4 million from Grandma. This included direct account transfers, the house refinance, fraudulent credit card charges, sale of some of her investment assets, personal property he'd stolen and sold. He'd stolen $1.4 million in less than 2 years while keeping her drugged and compliant. His plan had been to continue until she died, inherit everything through the fraudulent will, and disappear with millions. Brandon's trial began in March 2023. He was charged with 11 felony counts, including elder abuse, causing great bodily harm, pharmaceutical fraud, financial exploitation, forgery, theft over $100,000, conspiracy, and criminal impairment of a vulnerable adult. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, toxicology reports showing the dangerous medication levels, medical testimony that the drugs caused Grandma's impairment, financial records showing systematic theft, the fraudulent prescriptions from Mexico, the video of Brandon administering pills and Grandma's subsequent impairment, the signatures on documents showing obvious impairment, testimony from Grandma about being trapped in confusion, testimony from doctors about her remarkable recovery once the drugs stopped. I testified as both a family member and an expert toxicologist. I explained exactly how the combination of drugs Brandon used would cause confusion and sedation. I explained that these are sometimes called chemical restraints when used inappropriately in nursing homes. I showed the jury that this was deliberate pharmaceutical manipulation designed to render Grandma compliant so Brandon could steal from her. I testified for 7 hours, and the prosecution told me later it was the most compelling expert testimony they'd ever seen. Brandon's defense tried to claim he was trying to help Grandma, that he'd obtained the medications because he thought they would help her symptoms, that he hadn't realized they were causing harm, that the financial transactions were gifts Grandma had willingly made. The prosecution destroyed this defense. They showed Brandon's internet search history, which included searches for drugs that cause confusion in elderly, how to make someone seem like they have dementia, medications that cause memory loss, how to get someone declared incompetent. These searches dated back to December 2021, just before he started drugging Grandma. He'd researched exactly how to do what he did. This was premeditated pharmaceutical poisoning. They also showed text messages between Brandon and an ex-girlfriend from February 2022, where Brandon wrote, "My grandmother is loaded, like 6 million loaded. If I can keep her confused long enough to get control of her money, I'll be set for life. I'm giving her stuff to keep her sedated, and she's signing whatever I put in front of her. By the time anyone figures it out, she'll be dead, and I'll have everything." This text message was direct evidence of intent and planning. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They found Brandon guilty on all 11 felony counts. His face went white when he heard the first guilty verdict. By the 11th, he was openly crying. He'd been so confident he'd be acquitted or get probation. At worst, he'd underestimated how seriously the jury took elder abuse. Sentencing was in May 2023. The judge was absolutely scathing. "Mr. Morrison, you systematically poisoned your 87-year-old grandmother with powerful sedative medications for nearly 2 years. You rendered her confused and compliant so you could steal $1.4 million from her. You isolated her from family. You made her sign documents she couldn't understand. You terrorized a brilliant woman by trapping her in pharmaceutical fog. You exploited her trust in the most despicable way possible. You planned this crime carefully and executed it without remorse. You represent the worst kind of predator, someone who preys on vulnerable elderly family members. The court finds that you are a danger to society and to any elderly person who might trust you. I am sentencing you to 30 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. You will also pay full restitution of $1.4 million plus damages, and you are permanently banned from serving as power of attorney, trustee, guardian, or caretaker for anyone for the rest of your life. 30 years. Brandon was 36 years old. He'd be 66 at minimum before any chance of parole. His entire adult life would be spent in prison. He destroyed his life for money he never got to keep. The criminal conviction meant all the fraudulent documents were voided. The power of attorney was invalidated. The property transfers were reversed. The will change was nullified. Grandma's original estate plan was reinstated. Everything Brandon had stolen was returned to her. The financial institutions cooperated fully because they hadn't known the transfers were fraudulent. Grandma recovered her full $1.4 million plus interest and damages from Brandon's seized assets. By the time everything was resolved, Grandma had actually actually gained money due to the court-ordered interest and damages. Brandon's mother, my Aunt Patricia, was devastated. She couldn't believe her son had done something so evil. She apologized to Grandma repeatedly, and their relationship was strained, but eventually healed. Patricia said she'd failed as a mother to raise someone capable of such cruelty. Grandma told her it wasn't her fault, that Brandon made his own choices and had to face the consequences. Grandma lived another year after Brandon's conviction. She was completely cognitively intact during that time. Back to her sharp, brilliant self, she updated her will to explicitly disinherit Brandon and leave her estate split equally among her other 4 grandchildren. She made me executor because she trusted me to handle everything properly. She told me multiple times that I'd saved her life, that if I hadn't figured out what Brandon was doing and stopped it, she'd have died while drugged and he'd have inherited everything. She said my toxicology training had literally saved her from a poisoner. Grandma died peacefully in her sleep in November 2024 at age 89. It was natural causes. She'd had a stroke and passed quickly without suffering. At her funeral, we celebrated her remarkable life and her strength. I gave a eulogy about how even at 87 she'd survived an attempt to destroy her and had come back stronger, about how she'd faced down a predator and won, about how she'd gotten justice. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Brandon is currently incarcerated at Arizona State Prison Complex, serving year 2 of his minimum 25-year sentence. He's written letters to family members asking for forgiveness and asking us to appeal for his early release. Every letter has been returned unopened. There is no forgiveness for what he did. He terrorized an elderly woman. He poisoned her. He stole from her. He tried to rob her of her final years of dignity and independence. He deserves every single year of that sentence. His criminal record means he'll be a registered elder abuser. When released, he'll never be able to work in healthcare or caregiving or finance. He'll be a felon in his 60s with no prospects. He destroyed his life trying to steal from his grandmother, and he gained nothing but decades in prison. I've used Grandma's case as a teaching example in my toxicology courses. I explain how pharmaceutical poisoning of elderly people works, what drugs are commonly misused, what symptoms to watch for, how to investigate and document suspected cases, how to work with police and prosecutors. I teach medical students and pharmacy students to recognize chemical restraint and pharmaceutical abuse. If Grandma's nightmare can help protect even one other elderly person, then something good came from it. I've also become an advocate for stronger protections for elderly people against pharmaceutical abuse. I've worked with Arizona legislators to pass stricter laws about who can obtain and administer medications to elderly adults, about requiring independent oversight when someone takes power of attorney over an elderly relative, about mandating medication audits when sudden cognitive decline occurs. Grandma's law, as it's now called, passed in 2024 and will protect countless elderly Arizonans from predators like Brandon. I inherited part of Grandma's estate as she intended. I've used that inheritance to establish the Patricia Morrison Elder Protection Fund, which provides grants to investigators and prosecutors handling elder abuse cases. I want to make it easier to catch and prosecute people who prey on vulnerable elderly people, the way Brandon preyed on Grandma. Every time I help fund a case that leads to conviction, I think about Grandma and how she'd be proud that her story is helping others. Some people have asked if I feel guilty that my nephew is in prison. I feel zero guilt. Brandon made calculated, deliberate choices to poison and rob an 87-year-old woman. He researched how to do it. He planned it carefully. He executed it without remorse over nearly 2 years. He showed no empathy for Grandma's suffering. He was willing to let her die while drugged to inherit her money. He deserves 30 years and more. I only wish he could serve longer. The fact that he's my nephew doesn't change that he's a dangerous predator who destroyed an elderly woman's life for money. I think about Grandma every day. I'm grateful I had the training to recognize what was happening. I'm grateful I didn't give up when family members didn't believe me. I'm grateful I documented everything and worked with police to build an unbeatable case. Most of all, I'm grateful Grandma got to spend her final year clear-minded and free from the pharmaceutical fog Brandon had trapped her in. She got justice, and she got to die with dignity on her own terms. That's what matters most. This is my story. I'm Dr. Rebecca Morrison. I'm 43 years old. I'm a clinical toxicologist with 19 years of experience. My nephew Brandon drugged my 87-year-old grandmother Patricia with sedatives for 2 years to keep her confused, while he stole $1.4 million and tried to steal her entire $5.6 million estate. I used my toxicology expertise to recognize the pharmaceutical poisoning. I documented everything. I built a case. I worked with police and prosecutors. Brandon was convicted of 11 felonies and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Grandma recovered completely and lived her final year with dignity and clarity. Justice was served completely, and Brandon will spend the next 25 years minimum in prison, knowing he destroyed his life trying to poison a toxicologist's grandmother. He chose the worst possible victim and paid the ultimate price.